hundreds of thousands of them, fathers, sons, and brothers. But the war began before a single shot was ever fired. Writers served as its first soldiers, and the battle lines were drawn in ink. Emerging Realism, Historical Context. The central influence on literature of this period was the conflict between North and South that ended in the Civil War. Although romantic attitudes helped push the nation into war, 4 years of bitter fighting led to a new realism. A cultural divide. A house divided against itself cannot stand, wrote Abraham Lincoln in 1858, referring to the bitterly divided United States. Since colonial times, the South and the North had shown strong regional differences. Most of the manufacturing and financial services of the nation were located in the North, whose economy was based primarily on trade and industry. In contrast, the South had developed an agricultural way of life, growing cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane for export to the North and Europe. That relied on the labor of nearly 4 million slaves. Most Southerners opposed any interference with slavery by the federal government because of the region's economic independence on it, the widespread fear of slave unrest, and the belief that states should control their own affairs. Slavery divides the nation. Although political leaders tried to sidestep the slavery issue, growing Northern opposition to slavery and its expansion into the West made confrontation inevitable. In 1850s, several events moved the country to its breaking point. In Kansas, the vote over whether to join the Union as a free state or a slave state turned deadly when gun-toting mobs swarmed over the border from Missouri to cast illegal ballots in favor of slavery. Continuing violence between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers led people to begin calling the territory Bleeding Kansas. Abolitionist John Brown played a role in Bleeding Kansas in 1856, killing 5 pro-slavery men as revenge for the sacking of the anti-slavery town of Lawrence. 3 years later, Brown again shocked the nation when he led a bloody raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping to spark a slave uprising. Writer Henry David Thoreau called Brown an angel of light, but fellow writer Nathaniel Hawthorne retorted, "No man was ever more justly hanged." Conflict reaches the government. Even the floor of the U.S. Senate became a battleground. In 1856, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner gave an impassioned speech against slavery, berating his colleagues for 2 days for their support of slavery. A few days later, Carolina Congressman Preston S. Brooks retaliated by attacking Sumner with his cane, beating the Massachusetts senator unconscious. When writer William Cullen Bryant heard about the caning, he was outraged. "Has it come to this," he asked in the New York Evening Post, "that we must speak with bated breath in the presence of our Southern masters? Are we too slaves for life, a target for their brutal blows? When do we not comport ourselves to please them?" Meanwhile, newspapers across the South applauded the attack, describing abolitionists as unruly dogs to be collared and disciplined. Such angry name-calling and accusations reflected and added to the growing sense on both sides that Northerners and Southerners were no longer simply Americans from different regions, but foreigners and enemies. In 1857, the Supreme Court entered the fray by hearing the case of Dred Scott, a slave whose owner had taken him to spend several years in a free state. Scott argued that living in a free state made him free. The Supreme Court ruled against him. Worse, it went on to say that even free black slaves had no rights which a white man was bound to respect. The Dred Scott decision sent shockwaves through the already divided nation. Northerners were outraged and alarmed. Was the South's particular institution of slavery to become the law of the whole land? The Civil War. Ironically, none of these acts led to the final break. Instead, the lawful election in 1860 of a political moderate U.S. President, Abraham Lincoln, ignited war. Enraged at Lincoln's pledge to stop the western spread of slavery, the southern states seceded to form the Confederate States of America. For a generation that had grown up on the literary ideal of the brave, dashing romantic hero, the booming of Confederate cannons fired on Fort Sumner in the spring of 1861 was a call to glory. Boys and young men rushed off to join the Union or Confederate Army. Southerners boasted that a single one of them could lick 10 Yankees. Northerners were sure that Johnny Reb would turn and run at the first shot. For many, the biggest fear was that the war would end too soon and they would miss their chance to become heroes. The mood was nearly festive on the sunny July day when fresh Union forces marched south into Virginia to confront the rebels at Bull Run. Soldiers wandered from their lines to pick blackberries and drink cool water from the creek, and the cream of Washington society drove down in carriages with bottles of champagne and picnic baskets to enjoy the spectacle. Reality strikes. By late afternoon, thousands of dead and wounded soldiers lay near the bank of Bull Run. On the losing side, panic-stricken Union soldiers stumbled away from the battlefield, their feet tangling in shawls and parasols that had been dropped by terrified civilians as they fled. The party was over. The blood-soaked Battle of Bull Run gave everyone, especially the losing Union side, a taste of the reality of war. But it was only the beginning. 4 long years of fighting followed. Names of battle sites became synonymous with death. Shiloh, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, Vicksburg. When the war ended at last in April 1865 with General Robert E. Lee's surrender to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, approximately 618,000 men had died, nearly as many Americans have died in all other wars that the United States has ever fought. Much of the South lay in ruins, scarred by gutted plantation houses, burned bridges, and uprooted railroad lines. Ideas of the age. Americans in the post-war period embraced notions of freedom and unity. At the same time, they lost their taste for romanticism, having been confronted with the harsh realities of war. Freedom and unity. The United States was changed by the Civil War. It had suffered bitterly and was now a wiser, more somber nation. Yet the ideals of America's founders had survived the devastation of war. For the first time, the Declarations of Independence notions of equality and liberty for all were brought closer to fruition. Slavery was dead, outlawed by Lincoln's bold Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. "We shout for joy that we live to record this righteous decree," said Frederick Douglass, "free forever." The Civil War had divided the country. Its end brought the country back together. This time, the country was united in a new way. Before the war, people were used to saying the United States are, with emphasis on the individual states more than on the united interests of all. After the war, people began saying the United States is. A group of independent states had become one nation, indivisible, with the goal of liberty for all. The Civil War changed not only American society, but its literary culture as well. In the years following the war, American readers and writers found they had lost their taste for romanticism. Many had witnessed war's grim nature firsthand, and it shaped their view of life. Gallant heroism and adventure no longer suited America's tastes, nor did meditations on the beauty of nature or the worth of the individual. Writing became more honest, unsentimental, and ironic. A new style, realism, would predominate in the years to come. Literature of the times. The Civil War was a transitional period for writers of the day. Groundbreaking poets, former slaves, famous public figures, and everyday people all contributed their ideas to the country, and its literature moved from romanticism to realism. Brilliant mavericks, Whitman and Dickinson. In 1842, when the conflicts leading to the Civil War were just beginning to brew, the Romantic movement was going strong. Writer Waldo Emerson issued a challenge to America. The nation needed a poet worthy of itself, a truly fresh voice with limitless passion and originality. "I look in vain," lamented Emerson, "for the poet whom I describe. We do not, with sufficient plainness or sufficient profoundness, address ourselves to life." In the coming decades, two poets would answer Emerson's bold call, Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. Outwardly, Dickinson and Whitman had little in common. Whitman, big, bearded, and outspoken, was always in the thick of things and wrote many poems about current issues and events, from the sad plight of the slave to the shocking assassination of President Lincoln. Dickinson, on the other hand, was shy and reclusive, living her whole life in her native New England and finding inspiration for her poetry in her own thoughts. Rule breakers. The two, however, were not entirely unalike. Both felt hemmed in by the conventional ideas of how poems ought to look and what poems ought to say. Both wrote poetry so radical in form and content that it took many years for readers to appreciate it. In Dickinson's case, appreciation didn't come until after her death. Together, they broke poetry wide open, creating the most remarkable work of the Civil War era. In 1855, Whitman published at his own expense a book of poetry called Leaves of Grass. The book was small, but it contained a huge ambition. Whitman saw America as a great poem, the greatest in the world, and his job was to capture it on paper. A sprawling, rowdy, vigorous young nation, he believed, could not be squeezed into traditional poetic forms. Instead, he wrote in free verse, unconfined by formal patterns of rhyme and meter. His lines were loose and rambling, his language was colorful and vigorous, and he refused to limit himself to poetic subjects. If it was part of American life, it was his to write about, even if it was topics that others might consider common or vulgar. Emily Dickinson also found traditional poetic forms inadequate. Yet where Whitman's poems were expansive, hers were terse and compressed. A few brief lines packed with complex original images. Her subject matter was intensely personal, and her themes were the great themes of life: love, death, immortality, and nature. Although she wrote nearly 18,000 poems, 1,800 poems, only a handful appeared in print during her lifetime. In fact, she was virtually unknown in her time, living a reclusive life that belied the intense creative fervor of her inner world. Neither Dickinson nor Whitman can easily be categorized. Although Whitman can be considered a romantic poem because of his emphasis on individualism, emotion, and nature, his exploration of topics others found vulgar was certainly not romantic. Dickinson, too, could be aggressively unromantic with her images of ordinary household items and her abrupt, unemotional tone. Perhaps both poets can be seen as transitional, moving with Americans of the day from romanticism to realism. Literature of the Civil War. Of all human action, none speaks so dramatically nor so violently as war. Of all wars, civil war, by its very nature, divides a nation's voice into factions. Among the diverse literary voices heard during the Civil War, some of the most powerful were African American. Often at the urging of abolitionists, former slaves who escaped to the North published slave narratives detailing their experiences. These tales of suffering were immensely important to the cause of anti-slavery. Not simply autobiography, they were testimony, giving lie to Southern claims that slaves were happy and well treated, that slavery was a positive good for both master and slave, and that people of African descent were inferior to whites. More than that, the narratives made readers care by showing the slaves were real human beings who suffered and wept and longed for freedom. Personal experience was central to the literature of the time because everyday life now had great historical significance. Writers, male and female, white and black, from highest-ranking general down to the common foot soldier, shared their Civil War in diaries and letters. While these writers addressed their words to friends and family or even to themselves, others, such as President Abraham Lincoln, wrote for a larger audience. Still, Lincoln underestimated the reach of his words. "The world will little know nor long remember what we say here," he proclaimed in his Gettysburg Address, which is in fact proved to be one of the most enduring works of the Civil War era. Lincoln's speech, with its inspiring message and elevated language, represents the highest ideals of the period. The fiction created after the war by realistic writers such as Ambrose Bierce and Stephen Crane, however, show the period in a harsher light. Their stories focus on the human tragedy of war that destroyed hundreds of thousands of American lives, even as it freed many more. In the years to come, realism would grow and refine itself to include the work of many writers countrywide, from the frozen North Arctic north of Jack London to the plains of Willa Cather's frontier. It would develop to include the work of naturalist writers who view human beings as passive victims of their environment. Brought on by the brutalities of the Civil War, realism would become the form that, to some extent, still dominates American literature today.